All right. Well, as we start heading toward Easter, we're doing the same thing with the youth. And one thing that you try to do with youth is you try to make some kind of activity that connects a little bit with the message. And I'm not real good with that a whole lot. But this past week we talked about Lazarus, and so I told the kids, I said, the Bible talks about mummies. And did you know that the Bible talks about mummies? And where does it talk about mummies? And they, but a couple of them came and said, well, maybe with Jesus. And I said, technically so. It does talk about that he was wrapped with cloth. But, and of course, the other one is Lazarus. And so to help them with that, they decided to become mummies. So we have 3 different pictures. So this was our activity. This was a pretty good one. They did good. And then the next one, we that was the winner. That seemed to be the most actual best mummy. And then the last one had to have a little bit of breathing room for the mummy. So, but it was funny. So we did that activity, and then I asked them that question. Are there mummies in the Bible? And of course they were like, what are you talking about? And then we read through the story of Lazarus, and sure enough, it basically talks about that stuff. He was all wrapped up in clothes, and then he started walking around. And we don't think about that. We just think of the story of Lazarus. But whenever he would have come out, he would have been wearing all of that stuff, right? And it's kind of a fascinating story to think about. But the story obviously is talking about more than just kind of an entertaining thought. There's so much packed into the story of Lazarus. And so we're going to be in John chapter 11. We're going to go verse 17 through 44 is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And I do think it's important because this is a kind of a transition point in John where Jesus and the disciples, they've been serving now for nearly 3 years. Tensions are growing with the religious leaders, things like that, and Jesus is off. He's not close to Bethany. Bethany is where Lazarus and Mary and Martha, who are all siblings, that's where they lived. Bethany is very close to Jerusalem. Jesus was not in that area, and they sent word to him to come to Bethany. And basically the disciples, they kind of are like, it may not be a good idea to go back to Jerusalem, right? This isn't a good time. Maybe you should let things cool off, right? And Jesus does delay a couple of days, right? He hears the word of Lazarus, and then he's waiting. But I mean, he would have been late even if he would have left right away, right? But finally, Jesus says, we're going. And this is interesting. We love kind of ridiculing doubting Thomas. But this is in verse 16. It says, Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go so that we may die with him. Right? So that's a throwaway line, but that's pretty, it shows the tension, right? That Thomas basically, he realizes, that's it. We've been in it for 3 years, we might as well keep going, right? And so they start headed to Bethany. And this is the scene that we find. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up and quickly went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, and he has been in there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of those standing around me, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." It's really just a pretty amazing story, isn't it? I mean, you can get the visual. I love how John includes in there Mary saying, "Yeah, he's been in there 4 days. He's going to stink," right? It brings this practical aspect that, hey, this did happen, right? I mean, those it's kind of the ugliness of it, that makes us a little uncomfortable. But yeah, all of that happened, and I love what's happening here, and of course the main part and key of this whole passage is when Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Right? That's the key to this whole thing. But Jesus is entering in and calling people from darkness from different perspectives, right? You have Martha, Mary, and then Lazarus. And I think there's some things that we can learn from the way that Jesus interacts with each one of them. Martha, she is, obviously hurting, and Jesus gets there, and the first thing she says is, "If you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened," right? Even other people kind of said that. And now they weren't thinking that he would have kept him, that he would have raised him from the dead earlier. They were just like, man, if he could have made a blind man see, he could have healed him from whatever ailment that Lazarus had, And so, of course, Jesus wasn't there. And Martha, that's her first question is, "Lord, if you would have just been here." But it's kind of interesting. It's not, you don't get the sense that there's a lot of anger there. But she's hurting, and then she kind of comes at it. She has some intellectual questions. She's kind of asking, "God, why didn't you do something?" And Jesus responds to her with intellectual response, right? So Martha says, "Yeah, I know that he's going to rise again eventually," right? And Jesus, then he says that wonderful thing, "I am the resurrection and the life." And Martha comes back, and he basically elicits a response from Martha. Say, "Do you believe this?" And she gives a profound testimony. "Yes, you are the Son of God. You are the Christ who has come into the world." Right? You don't see that very often throughout the New Testament, right? And even Jesus is kind of protective of that early on. Now, of course, we're getting to the end of his ministry. But it's that response, the belief that response was being circulated is why Jesus was killed, right? So that's a powerful thing, and Martha was willing to just say that out loud. And Jesus basically was saying, "Do you believe this?" Right? And he was basically meeting Martha where she was. She needed to kind of be encouraged again. Hey, you know the truth. It's going to be okay, right? Jesus was meeting her where she was. He was preparing her, and he was teaching her. He was bringing her out and giving her some hope in the midst of the loss of her brother. And he did it in a very kind of teacher way, because that's how she viewed Jesus. That's what she needed. And then you have Mary. Mary, she's the one that would have been at the feet of Jesus, right? She's the one that would have, at another point, has washed Jesus' feet with her hair. She's very emotional, clearly, right? Martha's the one that's back in the kitchen, making sure everything's organized. Mary's the one sitting at the feet of Jesus, just listening and just wanting to be there, right? She's kind of the free spirit of the group, you know? And so she's weeping. And so she goes out to find Jesus. And when Jesus sees her, he's overcome with emotion. Isn't it really interesting, the difference between the way that Jesus interacted with Martha and the way that he interacts with Mary? Mary is crying, she's hurt, and she says the exact same thing. Says, Lord, if you would have just been here, right, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus' response to Mary is to weep with her, right? Because he knows that's what she just needs a hug. She just needs someone to cry with her. He knows that that's going to give her encouragement. That's going to give her hope, right? But then Jesus knows that there's more to this story. See, he's already, in a sense, he's already brought life into a dark situation for Mary and Martha, right? He's already giving them hope. He's reassuring them of his presence. He's reassuring them of God's presence through this. And they don't know what's yet to come, right? But then he goes to the tomb, and what a wonderful picture this is, where he gets some people to roll the stone away, right? And of course, there's so many connections with what he's going to be going through in a short amount of time. But he gets people to roll the stone away, which you can imagine they're just kind of like, well, I guess we'll humor this guy, right? And they do it, and nothing happens, right? Okay, now there's an open grave, and I can just imagine there's just kind of this awkward moment. They're all just kind of, all right, there's the dead guy is still in there. You know, I mean, what's going on? And then Jesus, really interestingly to me, he says, Lazarus. He calls his name, right? There was a joke, and one of the things that it said, of course he said Lazarus. If he would have just said, come out, there'd been people walking out of the tombs all over the place, right? No one would have known who it was. So, but he said Lazarus. He spoke his name. He speaks into the darkness of the cave, into the darkness of death. And he says, come out. And Lazarus walks out. Still with the effects of death on him, right? And Jesus says, okay, now clean him up and let him go, right? And I love, there's so much imagery here of Jesus entering into this darkness. And he does it in different ways. We see him do it in different ways with Mary and Martha, but then very specifically with Lazarus. He calls out into the darkness, calls his name, and says, hey, you want to come out? You want to experience life again? And of course, Lazarus does it. You know, and I think about that for us. You know, obviously, when you physically die, you're not going to come back to life again. I pretty much go ahead and bet on that, all right? But Jesus is calling to you right now to come out of the darkness and experience the light. He's calling you right now to start experiencing what life really is supposed to be. You know, and I think what we don't always realize, and especially what the world doesn't realize, is that they're living this life in the tomb, right? They're living in darkness. They get glimpses of hope and joy and peace, but they don't know what it really is. And it's not until you respond to Jesus calling your name that you get to come out of the darkness and into the light, right? Now, whenever we do respond and respond like Martha did and say, yes, Lord, I do believe in you. I do believe in that you are the Christ. We stumble out of that grave, right? But the clothes of death are still kind of on us, right? Because we're not fully into the presence of God yet. We're not fully into his kingdom, right? Things haven't been fully restored yet. So there's always going to be those effects of death that mess with us, that kind of try to keep pulling us back, if you will, into the tomb. But we need to keep listening to the voice of Christ that is calling us out of that, where he's saying, I am the resurrection and the life. And that's interesting because those two terms are very similar, but they are different. The resurrection, I am the resurrection, which means I overcome death, right? And the life. He doesn't just overcome death for us, which means he doesn't just give us the ability to live forever with him, right? That's not all he's doing. He's also the life, which means he gives us the life to live in this world the way that he created us to live. He gives us full life. He gives us abundant life. He gives us a life that is worth living, right? And that's what he's saying. That's what he's saying there to Martha when he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. And even though he may die, or he will die, right, physically, he will live, right? It's kind of this, and John likes to make things kind of a little complicated and make you think about them, right? But he's basically saying, yeah, you're going to physically die, but that just means you're going to be alive with him forever. And not only that, you're going to be able to have true abundant life here and now. When he says, I am the resurrection and the life, he's not just talking about something that is to come. He's talking about something that can happen right now. But we have to respond. And I believe that Jesus is calling to all of us. Lazarus, come out. He's saying, come out of that darkness. Quit living in the darkness and the reality of death and start living in the reality of life. Start getting rid of those shreds of mummified cloth. Start shaking them off, and so that you can live the way that God created you to live. Man, what an amazing scene for Jesus to be there and say, Lazarus, come out. Imagine being Lazarus. Walking out. You've been dead for 4 days. You walk out, you're blinded by the sun, you can't even see. And all of a sudden, life looks completely different. And you have a second chance at life. And whatever it was that Lazarus knew he needed to change in that previous life, I can guarantee you he started to change it. Whatever the regrets he had in that previous life, I guarantee you he started to work on those. He looked at life completely different. You know what? When we experience and when we respond to the call of coming into new life from Christ, we have another chance, a chance to start life again. Allow Christ to fill you with the new life that he gives us. He's calling you to come out of the grave, respond to him, and live in the light that he has provided, and live in the life that he created you to live. Let's pray together.